Okay, so today is 19th of October in 2022, and my name is Stuart Parkin from the University of York, and it is my great pleasure to have Professor Stuart Parkin at Max Planck Institute of Microstructure Physics. And we've been known each other since we first met at a workshop in Nagoya, so probably over 20 years we know each other. And it is very nice to have Stuart today because he's a very well-known physicist in spintronics. And I'd like to welcome you, Stuart. And I'd like to thank you for sharing your time with us to get interviewed for this IEEE Oral History project. So we will begin with some formal part. So I'd like to ask you to state your full name, the date of birth, as well as the place where you were born.
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this interview. My full name is Stuart Stephen Papworth Parkin, and I was born on December 9th, 1955, in a suburb of London called Watford. It's in the northwest part of London.
Thank you. So please tell us about your childhood. So you grew up near London area. What was your daily life looks like, and did you have any hobbies or any extracurricular activities?
Okay, so I was born in London, in Watford, as I said, but I lived there till I was about 9 when we moved to a suburb of Manchester in Cheshire, a small city called Bowden. And from the age of 9 to 11, I went to a small Church of England school in Bowden. And then when I was 11, I took an examination for all kids in the northern part of England. And I then was accepted into a school called Manchester Grammar School. At that time, it's called a direct grant school, which meant that the government would pay your expenses to attend the school. And I attended that school till I was 15. So it meant actually, because it was in Manchester, that I had to every day I used to run to the station in Altrincham and then take a train to Manchester, central Manchester, and then from there a bus to the school. So that took like an hour every day, backwards and forwards each way. So I spent a lot of time on the train, bus, and running to and from the school. And that meant that on the train I would do my homework. But that meant really, I didn't really in some sense have so much contact with my schoolmates because I lived in Bowden, a long way from Manchester. I did have some hobbies. I used to like plants. I used to collect cacti, and for some time I had a collection of cacti. But actually, when I was 15, we moved then to north to a suburb of Edinburgh, actually in across the river from Edinburgh, and I lived in a place called Dalgety Bay. And again, I went to school in the city of Edinburgh. I went to the Edinburgh Academy, which is a public school. And then I used to again take buses and trains. And in that case, the train station in Edinburgh Waverley Station, I would then run or walk to the school. And that's what I did. So really from the age of 11 till I guess I was 17 or 18, I used to spend a lot of time traveling to and from the school. And that's so so I didn't really have so many hobbies, I would say. I wasn't so interested in sports. And my hobbies were, I read a lot of books. Those were my main hobbies. Collected some plants. I used to collect a few animals, toads. And I think I had 2 budgerigars and some gerbils. But actually, I wasn't that keen on any of those animals. The best animals were the toads, because you had to do nothing with them. They would just live in the water and occasionally need to be fed some meat, I think.
Okay.
That was it. My hobbies were mostly reading, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you have any particular book you liked?
So in those days I would read a lot of novels, and but I think I did that for several years. But then I eventually I think I decided that you can only read so many novels, and then the stories are pretty much the same, and there's not so much to be learned. So then I stopped reading novels.
Okay. That's interesting. So did you have any dream? So what you want to become?
Yeah, I think I always was interested in becoming a scientist or learning something about the world and how it works. I think from a pretty early age, we used to build things, not not much really. My brothers and sisters, we used to build what we called go-karts, like little carts made of wood with wheels. You could run on, go play on the streets when I was a kid in Watford. And then after that, as I said, all my brothers and sisters, we all went to different schools. So I really also didn't have so much interaction with them either. And so I was pretty, alone, I would say. I was a shy kid. I spent pretty much the time by myself.
So in your school days, did you have any particular person who influenced you?
In school days?
Yes.
No, I mean, there were one or two teachers who I remember I had a Russian teacher in my school, Manchester Grammar School, who for some reason, he would take an interest in me a little bit, since I was super shy. So he tried to get me out of my shyness. And there was a maths teacher who, similarly, but I was only there for 4 years, and I really didn't, not really. But when I was in Edinburgh, there was also a physics teacher. I wanted to do physics, and I was pretty good at it. So I guess he was interested in what I was doing, but no particular teacher stood out, I would say.
Okay. I think you were very quiet and
Yeah, I was very shy, and I also played the piano. I taught myself. My father was a very good pianist. He didn't teach me, but I somehow taught myself, and I can play the piano reasonably well, but I don't really practice anymore. But I used to play the piano from time to time.
Yeah, that's very nice. So did you have any kind of life-changing moment or anything particularly you remember from your early days?
Life-changing? No, I can't think of anything.
Okay, so you had quite consistent life, I guess.
Yeah, consistent life. Yeah.
Very
I used to
nice.
sing in the choir in the church. And then, like I said, a good voice. So I became a soloist a little bit for a couple of years, even though I was super shy. That was about it. Not really life-changing. I went to church, but I'm not religious, and I'm an atheist, actually.
Yes. So then you went to the University of Cambridge.
Yes.
So why did you choose Cambridge?
Okay, when I was growing up, I mean, really, in my school, Manchester Grammar School, it was, people who were very good in terms of passing exams, and so they really encouraged people to apply to Oxbridge. That was a sort of a measure of the success of the school. And so they strongly encouraged people to go to Oxbridge. And in any case, it was widely believed that Oxford, Cambridge were the best universities in the UK. So I decided to go to Cambridge because I was interested in science. And in particular, I actually always wanted to go to Trinity College, because Trinity College was the college where Isaac Newton was a fellow. And of course, he was also one of the founding fellows of the Royal Society. Eventually, I became a fellow of the Royal Society, which I'm very proud of.
Yes, of course. It's very difficult to become the fellow of the Royal Society.
So I was very pleased that eventually I did become I was a research fellow, which was one of my, I'm very proud of this, because when in my second year on my PhD, I wrote my thesis, and then also used the thesis as in the annual competition in my college for a research fellow. And I was elected a research fellow, which I think is very good, because you compete with all disciplines. And the research fellowship at that time, I'm not sure, I think it's probably the same. It funds you, it pays you for 4 years, it pays you some kind of stipend for 4 years out of 6. So you can go away from Cambridge and come back. And actually, that's what I did. So after I completed my PhD, I decided I went first to France and to work in the group of Denis Jerome, and then went back to Cambridge briefly. And then I went to America with this Royal Society, with the concept that I could always come back to Cambridge. But actually, of course, when I went to America, IBM Research paid me as a postdoctoral fellow.
You still have the possibility to come back to Cambridge, right?
Yes, it turns out then I never actually used all those years. I think I barely used it at all, because I finished my PhD. Well, I guess I used it for 1 year in my third year of my PhD. And then you have to wait anyway. You could not, I think, graduate till after 3 years, or I guess whatever the numbers of terms are. And when I graduated, then I almost immediately left for Paris. went back for 3 months after I spent about 18 months in Paris. In Paris, I had a fellowship from the Royal Society, a Royal Society Exchange Fellowship. And then when I went to IBM, I remember IBM had this program for bringing very good people from postdocs from Europe. They called it a World Trade Fellowship. And I got this World Trade Fellowship, which meant that European IBM companies would pay for the European postdocs to go to American research centers. So I went to San Jose, to the IBM San Jose Research Laboratory at that time.
So how did you find those places?
Mhm.
Did you see all the advertisement or you applied?
No,
directly?
so I didn't apply. Actually, my whole career, I never really applied for any job. So what happened was, when I went to Paris, it was because when I was in Cambridge, it's a little bit strange. During my, I was I had an entrance scholarship, and I always did very well in exams, senior scholarship, and that allowed me to live in college for my 3 years. And my tutor was Tony Weir. And one time, when I was trying to decide what to do, I think it was again, when you went up to Cambridge in those days, you went up to do a physical sciences tripos, which meant that you could do chemistry, physics, mathematics. I think I did crystalline solids. And the subject I liked most actually was crystalline solids. But he said to me, my advisor, my tutor, said to me, that you've got to do something very fundamental. You should focus on physics, theoretical physics. And that's what I did. So I then focused on my second year. I did physics with a theoretical physics option. That meant I had to do no experiments and just took another exam. I was super good at exams. Of course, I did extremely well in all these exams. I think it was like top of my year. All years, and because of that, then I was, without doing anything, they sort of asked me, do you want to do a PhD? And I said, oh, why not? And then I really no idea why, but I decided to switch from a theoretical PhD to doing experimental physics. I'm not really sure why. And then I think might have been because Richard Friend was in Trinity College at the time. I think he was just moving to St. John's College, and somehow I had some contact with him, and he gave me some advice, and I think very good advice about the experiments. But largely speaking, my PhD, again, I was very alone. I did pretty much by myself, and it turns out that he'd started to work on a series of these transition metal dihydrocarbons, which were intercalated with first row transition metals. And there's actually, I think, a technician, Sue Nelson, and she had grown all these single crystals. And so then I think he started to do some work, but then he left to go to Paris as a postdoc. And then, I built a small vibrating sample magnetometer, and I built a cryogenic system for measuring Hall effect as a function of temperature. It was a continuous flow cryostat. And I basically measured all these samples pretty much by myself. And that's what I did. That was my whole PhD. And I get to finish it off in 2 years. It's quite good, really. And so in some sense, so I got some advice from Richard, who occasionally come back, it seems, my recollection from Paris, and just see me in lab and give me a bit of advice. But then I wrote these papers. So the strange thing was I had very little contact with my official advisor. And in the end, I wrote no papers with him. So I wrote the papers and included Richard was on the papers. And that's what I did.
It's quite interesting. Richard is now the Cavendish professor, and you are the director of Max Planck Institute. So
So I've known Richard all these years, and I was on. He founded this center for sustainable physics, the Winton Center, and so it's very nice of him. I was on his advisory board, I think, for almost 10 years. The center lasted, is now over, and so I went back to Cambridge every year for his advisory board meeting, which was very nice. And so all these years, I've known him in various forms, and he's been very supportive and very kind. And he's, in some sense, he's my main mentor, I would say. And also, he was also very interested in doing physics and materials, in some sense, so in polymer, in his case, in polymers, and then building devices. He formed several companies. So I've also been very, very interested in not just doing fundamental science, but trying to see whether it has impact technologically. More so since, of course, I went to IPM research.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. set up Cambridge display technology and so on. So
Yes, he swayed several companies and with greater or lesser success.
so which part of the kind of education you got in Cambridge was the most beneficial for your career?
For me,
Yeah.
career-wise, I think Cambridge, I think just the fact that you could focus on doing research. I mean, during my undergraduate, I always remember that as being fantastic. You could spend 24 hours a day just reading and thinking and learning. I really enjoyed that, actually, tell you the truth. And then for my PhD, pretty much was, I mean, of course, you had people helped you a little bit, but mostly you do it by yourself. So you learn to be very independent. It was good. I enjoyed that.
Right. So you had the capability to do
Yeah, I
everything.
think I was fortunate.
independently.
Somehow it worked out. Yeah, I was lucky somehow. Mhm.
So then you said you moved to Paris and
Mm.
afterwards you went to IBM.
Mm.
So can you tell us about some differences, especially research environment or attitude in those places?
Well, that's very interesting. So I think Paris, in many ways, was similar. I went to Paris, actually, so the reason I went to Paris was Richard was a postdoc working in Denis Chiron's group. Then he came back to Cambridge, and basically I followed him. And it turns out the year before I went, Denis Chiron had a group where he basically had a high pressure group, high pressure transport, and he had a collaboration with Klaus Bechgard, a chemist from Copenhagen, and they discovered the now called the Bechgard salts, these two-dimensional, so one to two-dimensional organic compounds, salts, that became superconducting under pressure. And that's when I was in Paris, then I basically carried out a lot of high pressure studies of these materials and found, several more of these members that were superconducting. And they're very interesting because they have an anti-ferromagnetic ground state. So they're insulating into your apply pressure, they become metallic, they become superconducting. And that's actually, so I did that for a year and a little bit and published several papers and had some collaborated with a number of scientists there. And then I went back to Cambridge briefly, and then I simply wrote to Rick Green, who headed a group at IBM Research working on organic superconductors or organic metals. Because at that time, there was this Bill Little, professor at Stanford, had predicted that certain types of organic materials should show high temperature superconductivity. And that's this group at IBM was trying to find those materials. It was a very big group. And so I just wrote to Richard, and he said, please come as a postdoc. That's what happened. So I didn't really, I just wrote to one person. And at the same time, when I was leaving Cambridge to go to America, Elizabeth Marcelia, who was a very nice person I worked with, she was a scientist, not a professor, but she was an X-ray crystallographer. And so with her, I actually did a lot of structural experiments. So again, I was very independent. And these materials, these transition metal dihydrogenides, you intercalate them with all the first row transition metals. They become anti-ferromagnetic or ferromagnetic. And I wanted to understand what the magnetic structure was. And so first I went to Harwell, and I met a scientist there who told me that I should go to Grenoble. And so then I applied to Grenoble, and Jane Brown, who was the head of, I think, many of the instruments, then she was very kind. So I worked with her a little bit. I did two types of experiments. I did the first Weisenberg photography on one of these materials. And then eventually with Jane Brown, I did some polarized neutron diffraction to determine these structures. And so we tried to sort out the structures of some of these single crystals. So I did that. It was quite nice. And Elizabeth was a crystallographer, so she was also involved in these going first to Harwell, then to Grenoble. And that was kind of fun.
So did you have any particular preference in one of the places or?
No, it was just, I think, I always like to do different and new things. And it was very interesting to see these very different laboratories, how they would work. I think Harwell was sort of more old-fashioned, and Grenoble was a much more modern laboratory at that time. And they had one of very, very good neutron scattering facility, one of the best in the world at that time, probably still is. And it turns out also while I was in Cambridge, then one time there was a visitor from San Jose State University. Her name was Professor Akrivos, Jenny Akrivos. And she somehow was a visitor to the Cavendish lab. And one time she was visiting and wanted somebody to help her with some synchrotron experiments in California at Stanford. So I volunteered. And so that's how eventually, during my PhD, I visited California, spent a week. In fact, I had to, I spent 24 hours a day. It was fantastic at the synchrotron. And you just slept in a bunk bed on site. So it was a lot of fun. It was good, actually. And that's how I started to do synchrotron-based experiments. And that's how I got to know Jenny and continued to collaborate with her a little bit from time to time. The husband, actually, and Andreas Akrivos, he's a very famous scientist. He was, for some reason, moved from Stanford to one of the universities in New York. And anyway, I stayed in their house in Stanford quite a few times during this. So it was very nice. They were very nice couple. So it was nice, I think, just to meet these different people with different styles of doing research and these different facilities around the world. It was amazing. So this is a very international sets of people so I think this kind of international cooperation and collaboration is really important. And so I was very fortunate in a way that accidentally I went to Grenoble, went to Harwell, went to Stanford, the synchrotron during my PhD. Very short period of time.
Yes, I think you had a very unique experience.
That was fun. It was a lot of fun, actually.
And then finally you went to IBM.
That's right.
Also.
Yeah.
And at that time you said you were working on superconductor.
Yeah, so what happened was I went to IBM to work on these organic materials. And it turns out then during my postdoc there, and so there was a chemist, Ed Engler, and a number of other chemists there were making all these new materials. And I was looking at them under pressure, and I found one of these materials, which I call it ET, is the molecule. It's a BEDTTF molecule. It's a planar molecule. And one of the compounds I discovered was superconducting under pressure. So it's the second family of organic superconductors after this Beschkart sort. And so I published that in Physical Letters. I was the first author. So I'm kind of proud of that. But then soon after that, IBM decided that they wanted to, Ed Engler decided they wanted to give up this huge number of people working on these organic metals. I guess they decided the future wasn't as bright as they had once thought. And then Ed Engler decided they wanted a group to work on magnetism. So this was the research center at IBM was supposed to carry out, exploratory research, which could eventually potentially impact the IBM corporation. And so he said, look, down the street, there was this huge, IBM had this huge manufacturing facility for magnetic disk drives, which employed, I think, 10 to 20,000 people. And the research lab was actually at that time on the same plant site, but they were in the process, as I was a postdoc, of moving it and building a completely new facility in a big park they bought on the top of a hill a few miles away. And that was called the Almaden Research Center. And so then Ed decided that they should form a group in fundamental magnetism. Not really, they had groups working on technology, but they wanted to go more in the fundamental science of magnetism. And so then somehow he wanted me to work on that because of my background for my PhD in magnetic materials. And then it turns out that everybody involved decided to leave. So in the end, I was the only one left. Right? They appointed the manager who quit, and then somehow I ended up being in charge. And then actually I said, oh, I should go to, I think in Kyoto, that's right, to the International Conference on Magnetism to find out what's interesting. And then quite frankly, I came back and said, well, it wasn't that much interesting, but maybe these magnetic multilayers are interesting. And I wrote this report saying, oh, we should work on magnetic multilayers, and we should buy a molecular beam epitaxy system. And so I got like $1.2 million, which was 30 years ago. It was a lot of money, huge amount of money to buy the system. And it was going to be installed in a new lab in the new Almaden Research Center. And I persuaded eventually. So what I did, I went around the world looking at all the places that could build MB. So I went to Perkin-Elmer, I went to VG in the UK, and eventually decided to buy the system from PG. Plus, I persuaded them to like build a additional chamber for in situ analysis. Anyway, so what happened was then a different manager, Jerry Torrance, decided, well, he said to me, well, Stuart, you know nothing about thin films or growing thin films. We're going to hire an expert. And so then he hired somebody called Robin Farrow, a very nice man, who was an MBE expert. And then they said, well, this MBE system, this new lab you built, now belongs to Robin. And they gave him a technician, Ron Marks, and I was left with nothing. And then okay, then I thought, okay. Then I thought, oh, okay, what shall I do? And then eventually somebody told me, oh, IBM has this warehouse full of old equipment. And somebody said, why don't you take this old pumping system? It's like a vacuum chamber with an iron pump. And it has a so-called Wheeler flange. A Wheeler flange is a very old-fashioned flange. We use a copper, like a copper wire to form the seal, and you press it together. This is a Wheeler. Anyway, so I could, okay, great. I would use this, and then on top, I built a chamber, and I built it with 4 magnetrons. So that, well, the idea was you could then, I had 20 wafers in a carousel inside a heater, and then you could deposit on 2 wafers at the same time. This is why it's 4. Originally, it was going to be 3, then it's always 4. And then I used this to make multilayers. And it turns out this was fantastic. So I was very fortunate because the reason for buying the MBE system was because I visited numbers of groups in America, and they all told me, oh, you know, sputtering is no good. You need to use MBE to make the best films. And so then Robin and his technician would work for the next 20 years on the tiny, this is my interpretation, the tiny numbers of films, mostly based on rare earth metals. Well, that was super interesting. And then with my switching system, it turns out I could make 20 films a day, and I could check every night. I would open because it had no load lock. Very cheap. It cost $50,000. And this system that Robin has it, the MB, was 1.2 million. So 20 times less. And then every day I could make 20 wafers, and I wrote the software myself to control the system. And I do remember now. I had one year I had this fantastic young student from MIT as like a student, and he was really good. David Bronco, I think his name was, and he's the one who wrote the software. But he was brilliant. He was super fast and realized conceptually he did the minimum necessary to make it work, which was very good. And so that's what we did. I wrote the software for the transport system. So during my PhD, I built this transport system. So I wrote this system, and I remember it used a language IBM developed called APL, Advanced Programming Language. So I wrote this software. It's very nice. It's a symbolic programming language. Anyway, so because of that, I could make all these samples, 20 samples per day. And then I decided, it turns out that exchange bias is a very interesting property that was used by IBM in some of its magnetoresistive sensors. And you use it to set the magnetization at the end of a stripe, so that the middle part can respond. Is to prevent the motion of these magnetic domains. Anyway, so I decided to look at exchange bias, and in particular, finite size scaling. And then by varying the thickness of the antiferromagnet, I could then use the exchange bias to detect its nail temperature and its temperature dependence and how this evolved. And so that's what I did. And I remember now, I remember that when I first came to IBM, then Elizabeth Marcelia, she said she's found this advertisement for an assistant professorship at Berkeley. She said I should apply. So that's the only job I applied for, apart from asking Rick Green. And then eventually they offered me assistant professorship and a Miller fellowship. And then it was fantastic, very prestigious. But as usual, I was very indecisive. I couldn't make up my mind. Should I stay at IBM, where you basically just do research, or go to Berkeley, where you'd have to do research and teaching? And basically, and Leo Pelikov was the head of the physics department at that time. And so he was very nice, and we'd spend, over a year talk to one another. And eventually, by default, they said, if you don't make your mind by this day, it's over. This is what happened. And I stayed at IBM by default. But Leo, then, he was very nice. Then he invited me to I remember, a workshop in Los Potosi, which is north of Mexico City. And then I talked about this finite size scaling of this phenomenon at that school. That's what it. Then based on that, it was quite nice. Then I could look at exchange bias and look at the temperature balance and this finite size scaling. It's pretty nice. Unfortunately, I published the paper only in this conference proceedings of this school. I don't know why. I wasn't very good at writing things up. And that was one of my problems was that I know then what happened was high temperature superconductivity came along. Then everybody in the whole world switched to high TC. And then within IBM, because it was discovered in IBM Zurich, then everybody in San Jose, was kind of almost obliged to work on these high temperature superconductivity. And so then for maybe a couple of years, that's what we did. The chemists would make materials, and I would measure. I bought a squid, so I had to measure magnetic properties. But I didn't really enjoy it, I have to say, because it was just madness. Just people rushing into print with whatever they found. And I don't know, I wanted to think more about the data, and I don't know, so I didn't really like it that much. So what happened then was, then this Albert Fert and Peter Grunberg, they published this work, or Albert did, in Physical Letters on iron chromium. And I thought, oops, this is, MBE grown films. They saw this giant magnetic resistance at low temperatures only, super high magnetic fields, 2 Tesla. But I thought, it might be very interesting for applications, because I knew exchange bias was important. Why don't I work on this? And so then I just made multi-layers, and when I discovered I could see the phenomenon, but I discovered all these effects that they had not seen. And so I discovered that instead of the magnitude of the magnetic resistance decaying monotonically with increasing thickness of chromium, as Albert had published, I found, well, that wasn't true. It had these fantastic oscillations. And I discovered for the first time this oscillatory interlayer coupling. And then it turns out that the predictions about which materials combinations should show giant magnetic resistance were based on Albert's observation that it must be due to bulk spin-dependent scattering. And then all the predictions were wrong. And then, so I just used my own intuition, and I discovered that this was actually a phenomenon that varies systematically through the whole periodic table. So what I would do is I would make all these films, and then I did all the measurements by myself. And then it turns out that to measure the magnetic properties, if you use a squid magnetometer, it would just take forever. And they had so I told you, Almaden now is 5 miles from the main plant site. On the main plant site, they had a laboratory full of equipment for exploring the materials they were making for head sensors. And they had this thing called an alternating gradient magnetometer. Not much use, but they would only let me use it on Saturdays. So every Saturday, I would have these little orange boxes where you had these little things. I would cut up my 1-inch wafers into 2 by 2 millimeter squares, and then I would take like 40 or 80 of these samples down on Saturday morning. And then in an alternating gradient magnetometer, you could measure the hysteresis loop in a few minutes. And so I'd spend the morning and take all these hysteresis loops because I was really interested in the coupling field. So it was fantastic. And then I had all this data, and then I could see all these oscillations. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to do. Even if you measured transport, it would have taken too long. So this alternating gradient magnetometer was fantastic for this purpose. It doesn't really give you the magnitude of the moment, but it gives you hysteresis loops very rapidly. That was fantastic. And then I measure and see basically that you could see this oscillatory interlayer coupling. I found for nearly all the transition metals, and was able to show that the strength varied systematically. And with this, I discovered ruthenium gives the strongest anti-ferromantic coupling strength. And then it turns out, because then people would say to me, why is it interesting? What can you use this for? And then actually, it was a great time. At the same time, it was a terrible time, because here was me. I had myself and 1 engineer, Kevin Roche. That was my whole group. And we would do all these measurements, make all these films, make all these measurements. And then there was a group, a much larger group, in the same research center, but it was not in the basic science, what they call physical sciences. it was in a magnetic recording laboratory or something. And then this group kept on telling me, we don't believe in oscillatory coupling. It was crazy. So then I thought to myself, oh, I know a major problem they have. Okay, so then I invented this spin valve because this was based on my work on exchange bias, where you could separate two layers. And this is originally what I proposed. Anyway, and then this group was also working on spin valves. And I knew that if you want to use a spin valve in a sensing device, the major problem is that the two layers, if you have a reference layer and a second layer coupled, let's say through copper, and you set this one by exchange bias. Nevertheless, when you make tiny devices, the fringing fields cause huge coupling with the free layer. They didn't know how to fix this problem. So I came up with this idea one day when I knew about this problem. Like, oh, I could just build a synthetic antiferromagnet, or what I called an artificial antiferromagnet, and through my fantastic ruthenium coupling there. And then I demonstrated this. And of course, and then that was one thing I did. I came up with this concept of a synthetic antiferromagnet plus exchange bias plus copper, plus I showed that then there was this huge debate. Is the origin of giant magnetoresistance volume spin-dependent scattering, as Albert Fett claimed, or as I claim, it's all due to interfaces? Because if you make any type of structure in a thin film with interfaces imperfect, the scattering will almost always be dominant. In fact, it's not bulk, it's interface. And of course, nobody believed me. And then I remember Gary Prince was a famous scientist in MB growth of, let's say, iron on gallium arsenide. And he organized meetings, and then, everybody thinks all bulk, and I'd say, all interface. Anyway, eventually, I came up with this concept, I would use these, what I call dusting layers. So in between, they typically use permalox. It's super soft, and you need super soft, no low magnetostricted magnetic layer for the sensing layer. And so I put this cobalt layer at the interface, and I would make it, 0.2, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8, 1 angstrom, and then discover, I could double the spin valve magnetoresistance with 1 angstrom, 1.5 angstrom of cobalt. And then I would take that same cobalt layer and move it away from the interface, improve its interfacial. And then what happened was, cool, again, they want you to write patents. So I wrote a patent disclosure saying it's interfacial. And here's my concept. You need to put in these tiny interface layers, and then you can keep the 0 magnetostricted permalloy layer, but you've got 2 angstroms of cobalt, and hey presto, you've got twice the sensitivity. And then this group, remember the group was led by Virgil Sperioso, and you had this postdoc, Bernard Gieni, and they kept on claiming, no, it's all bulk, it's all bulk. They don't believe. And IBM said, what happened was, then they wouldn't let me publish my data, or they wouldn't let me patent it. They didn't believe it. And then what happened was, there was a meeting, International Conference on Magnetism, I think in Edinburgh, and the International Conference on Magnetic Films and Surfaces in Glasgow. And Gieni was invited talk, I think, in Glasgow. And I wanted to present my data, and the managers, those days there were 2 managers. One was Joe Storr, who eventually moved to the synchrotron. He was like a second-line manager. In my basic sciences, Virgil's group was on Browning Street. And those 2 managers said, you can't go and publish can't go to this conference to present your data unless you agree, you let all these other guys from Gieni and Sperioso and somebody else, Bruce Gurney, all their names had to go on my disclosure, because now they said, they found that they made a sample. I remember vaguely 10 angstroms of cobalt. Now they want their name on my disclosure, even though they've been 1 year fighting me, saying it's not interfacial. So I thought, this is crazy. Anyway, eventually they had to put their names, otherwise I couldn't present the data. Anyway, so then it was a big mess, because at this conference, you can see I was very upset with all these guys. Gieni gave an invited talk, 30 minutes, saying it's all bulk. Everything, anyway, I was going to say, everything he said was wrong. Anyway, and then it was like my talk, 15 minutes. And of course, it turns out they went on apparently way over time. And of course, the full interface, show my beautiful interface. And then, I think I remember now, Eric Kay was another second-line manager from, again, the physical sciences area. He was in the audience, and he said to me, how come, like you're saying exactly the opposite of Bernard? And of course I said, well, and in those days I was very, the first thing I said, well, he's just totally wrong, which he was. Anyway, and then when I got back to IBM, they were all very unhappy with me. The fact that I would say in public, but it was true. It was, what could I say? And the whole background was the same guys who were telling me I'm all wrong. I kept on showing all this fantastic data. Then they turned around and said they want their names on my patent. I think this is nonsensical. And then what I did, I submitted 2 papers without management approval. And then I think they knew, but anyway, like one to APL and one to Physical Letters. And then I think then what happened was the paper in Applied Physics Letters was published, and then Bob Scranton, who was the director of this whole magnetic storage research, the technology related, was complained, to management my side. Look, he's published this without permission. So then, I think, Dick Brundle, he was like I don't know, maybe he was my manager at the time. I can't remember how to change. He said, oh, then I had to take a week's holiday. That's the punishment, was I had to go home for a week and not come to the institute. Anyway, that was a very strange story. But it's kind of upsetting at the same time. It was kind of annoying. Everything I did, they would first deny, and then they want to take credit for. It was terrible. Everything they did was wrong. If you take a spin valve sandwich and you increase the copper layer, then the dependence of the magnetic resistance basically largely goes inversely with the thickness of copper, because it's the most conducting and it's all interfacial, plus an exponential decay is the mean 3 part in the copper. And again, Bernard had this exponential decay without this, what I call dilution factor. Totally wrong. So I published him from this. Totally right. Anyway, I like simple models, and this was a very simple model. So this time of GMR was interesting, but I felt like really all the major, I think I really do feel I made all the major discoveries. The interlayer coupling, it was interfacial, when the whole world was saying it's a bulk. And it turns out, if it were not interfacial, there would be no technological relevance, because, in order to make a sensor to detect transitions in a magnetic discharge, the sensing layer has to be very thin. And basically, if it were not interfacial, there would be no GMR. Anyway, it's very interesting.
Well, it's very interesting. And I do remember when you came to give a talk on a seminar at the Cavendish when I was a PhD student. Almost every slide you showed, you exclusively said, "Oh, these data are not published yet."
Oh yeah, I had a terrible. I couldn't partly because it's just me and Kevin, and so there was no time to do all these experiments and write papers, and that was so I probably didn't publish. I could have published so many more papers, and then also you had to get it approved by all these lawyers, and eventually, as it became quite quickly clear that it was going to be super important for IBM, then of course the more restricted they were on publishing. That was terrible. Anyway, I published I think I published a few papers, which were quite nice.
And you had many patents.
Had a lot of patents, indeed, yeah. Could have had many more. Many more patents.
Well, yeah. So you started your group from 2 of you.
Yeah.
And then how did you develop or increase the number of members?
It was always very tiny, quite frankly. It was very tiny until I became, I guess, you know what happened then. At some point, I started to work with Bill Gallagher from New York. He was in Yorktown. And then the Army had a call for proposals for magnetic memories. And so he and I proposed we could use magnetic tunneling junctions for a magnetic or random access memory. And the Army supported 3 proposals, one from us, Bill and I, one from Non-Volatile Electronics, Jim Dorton, and one from Motorola. And what happened was these other 2 groups, I think his name was, what was his name? Saeed Terani from Motorola. He was a very nice guy, very good manager. And Jim Dorton, they both proposed building magnetic random access memory based on giant magnetic resistance. And we realized it simply wouldn't work. because if you want a dense memory, you have to use a cross-point array. And in a cross-point array, you need the device has to be between a bottom and top contact. It has to have enough resistance. And the resistance has to be comparable to the output or the input impedance of a transistor. That has to be several thousand ohms. It's not possible with a metallic structure. So we already gave up and said it's impossible with GMR. So we said you have to use a tunneling junction device. And at that time, within IBM, then years earlier, actually Sadimichi Maekawa, when he was visiting Yorktown, and John Slonczewski had come up with this concept, but they never, finally they didn't publish it because there was a paper was published. Julia published this paper which demonstrated tunnel junction, low temperatures, and all the basic physics that Julia did. And so this, anyway, so then years later we said, and then years later, Miyazaki, Professor Miyazaki and Jagadish Mudera published these papers roughly at the same time where they claimed tiny effects, but the room temperature tunneling magnetic resistance, Julia's work was at low temperatures. And so we said, oh, I said, we're going to do this. And, with my little sputtering system, I could modify it to add a source for oxidizing aluminum. Oh, at that time, I know I built a second sputtering system, slightly more sophisticated with shadow masks. I wanted to do at that time, I was thinking of doing like perpendicular GMR and perpendicular transport. And so I modified it in fact, so I had a fantastic engineer, Robert Mizrahi. He was a great guy. I like to know he was had been an emigre from Egypt and had to leave because of his religion. And I hired him when he was 65. And he worked till he was 80 for me. And I kept on, encouraging him not to retire. He wanted to retire, but to stay. He was such a nice guy. He was like one of the most honorable people I know. I really respected him very much. And he was a fantastic designer. And together we designed a system where we could apply shadow masks with a 20 micron size system. And you have to design it so one mask is aligned with the next one. We did it completely mechanically with a pin. And these masks mustn't touch the substrate, otherwise you destroy the film. So we did all of this, and we built a system, this, again, 20 wafers, but you could decouple. And then we had a carousel with actually 4 masks, shadow masks, and then you could decouple, you could rotate the carousels automatically so that, on any one wafer, you could use different shadow masks and then sputter through this. So the masks plate carried the substrate, and then you sputter through the mask onto the substrate in a heating system. So we built this system, and then with that system, I could use to make these double junction devices. And so after so our project, this was Stuart Wolf at Office of Naval Research. He funded our proposal, and at the same time, Saeed Taranis at Motorola and Jim Thornton's at Novel Electronics. And I think that he was working with Honeywell. And then we, within like 2 years, could change the magnetic resistance from a few percent from Professor Miyazaki and Jagadish Mudera to 80%, which was basically maximum. And I always like to say that Jagadish always used to say, you cannot make a tunnel junction with a resistance area product less than 100 million ohms micron squared. And of course, within 2 years, I could decrease that down to a few ohms micron squared. So it's quite nice. And so in a few years, we had, just 2 years actually, we had shown new materials, new tunnel junctions, where the magnetic switching was perfect, had a resistance area product 100 million times smaller, roughly, than previously thought was possible, all made at room temperature, and with tunneling magnetic resistance values of up to 80%. And then with that, we could build a complete cross-point memory, 1,000 bits. It only took us 3 or 4 years after we made this proposal, which is quite good, I think. And then Bill was in charge at Yorktown of developing CMOS circuits, and that's what. So we worked together on that for a number of years. And then eventually, eventually I in 2004, or actually in 2002, I demonstrated using magnesium oxide by depositing magnesium there, oxidizing it. I can make very perfect tunnel junctions, which nobody had done before, and demonstrate magnetic resistance values of more than 200%. So it was very good, and that made MRAM possible. and that's what people use today. So that was fun.
Definitely.
And again, that was with a tiny group, just me. And of course, in this case, Robert Mizrahi was this designer, and there's nobody else.
And then I think you've got some big funding from the US government to make the brain-like memory or something.
No, that wasn't really me. That was another scientist, and that was much later. So before that, I got additional funding from, so Stuart Wolf, I think, funded us for 5 years, and I got additional 2 or 3 years funding to make what is this magnetic tunnel transistor, which is very nice. It's a hot electron device. And we demonstrated that, and again, I think that was very nice work we did. And that was, so by that time I had a couple of, no, that time, I know what happened. I became an IBM fellow, I come at year 2000, and then I persuaded the lab director, Robert Mizrahi, the lab director at the time, who was extremely good, to fund, I wanted to form a center with Stanford University, where we could have PhD students, that I would be, I was a consulting professor, and then I could have students who would do their PhD with me at IBM. And then for that, I needed, quite a lot of money. And so he agreed to fund this. And so that's how I started this project. And because of that, then I could have a bigger group. And then I had some very good students from Stanford. Some of them stayed on as postdocs. And so then my group was a little bit bigger. Yeah. And then this brain project, that was much later. And then the idea, indeed, as you said, I was very interested in building devices that could emulate the brain in terms of energy efficiency. And there's another scientist at IBM, he was much more interested in really building complete circuits, and whether with new materials or using standard silicon-based, CMOS-based concepts. And so what happened was, in the first year of this proposal that was funded, we had to demonstrate within 9 months that we could build a device with these neuromorphic properties that could be used. And it was really impossible. So after a year, then the person who was the real PI of this project decided just to abandon all this new materials and just focus purely on conventional CMOS-based circuitry that he would design in such a way that it could emulate properties of the brain to some extent. That's what he did. So then so it's tough.
Yes, but yeah, that's quite fascinating, and you are one of the pioneers, definitely.
So it turns out, again, we actually demonstrated, this was the Xinjiang, we had a fantastic result where we demonstrated we could use the tunnel. I always said the tunnel junction is a perfect neuromorphic device, because as you pass current, you can rotate the magnetization, change the resistance. So my concept was, we just build friction into this device so that it would switch, and you could design it so it switched back quickly or slowly. So it's like memory, short and long-term memory. It was fantastic. This is the idea. And so what we did, we actually built an array of 100 magnetic tunnel junctions. So we could use this to demonstrate time-dependent plasticity. And this is what we did. And that's what we did. But we never published it. We should have done. I think it would be a highly cited paper. Yeah. I wrote a patent, that's all. Again, I'm very bad at writing papers. Yeah.
But then you came up with an idea of racetrack memory.
Yeah, so what happened then was, it turns out at some point I became an IBM fellow around about, I think, 1999 or 2000. And when you become a fellow, it turns out as a fellow, you report to the chairman of the corporation and you become an executive. And so in some sense, you're actually the same level as the Almaden lab director or somewhere like that. So you have, in principle, a lot of influence. And essentially, because nobody can fire you. And so in those days, the IBM fellows were treated with a lot of respect and given some resources. And the lab director then, then what happened was, it was decided that they would sell the disk drive business. And then it was the first time, then they would sell to, in that case, the company they sold it to, I think it was Hitachi, I guess, they would sell all the people in research, in the technology, magnetic recording, they would sell all those people, give them all to Hitachi. And that was very unusual. They hadn't done this before, but they decided to keep me, and which is good. And then that's how I came out. Then I was thinking, what can we do that's better than a hard disk drive? And somehow I came up with this idea of the racetrack, pretty much just by myself. I remember in my office thinking about this and coming up with this concept, thinking this is a great idea. And then I wrote simple patents by myself. And yeah, and then I started to work on it. And at that time it was amazing because everyone told me, oh, it's impossible. You can't build these devices because you need, nanosecond long current pulses. Oh, it's very difficult. You need experts to help you. And then it turns out I had a very good PhD student, and I persuaded him, Masamitsu Hayashi, to work on this project. And then, again, it was like just the two of us. And within a short time, it took some time, 6 years, we could demonstrate the motion of these domain walls in a reproducible fashion. So that was very nice. We published a science paper, and I remember I gave a talk at some conference, and then Ian Osborne is an editor of Science, and he was at this meeting. And after he said, "Oh, maybe are you interested in writing like a perspective?" Because I was saying we need to go beyond. Everybody's talking about everything you do, magnetic disk drive, all conventional CMOS circuitry is really two-dimensional. You have a single layer of transistors, a single layer of magnetic bits. You need to go three-dimensional. This is what my racetrack can do. And so he was super interested, and I wrote this perspective now, which is, I think, my most highly cited paper on Science 2008. I was very, very proud of that. And I think racetrack has continued to work on it. And I never really understood at the beginning. IBM wasn't interested, and the whole community was much more interested, let's say, in the spin torque switching of the magnetic tunnel junction than in racetrack. So in a way, it was good because we could work on it. And we kept on making, I think, very interesting discoveries how the domain walls could be moved more efficiently. And so I continue to work on that today. And here we've made some fantastic discoveries just in the last couple of years. And I think it's continues to be not only continues to be, but is increasingly interesting and looks like it could actually work. So I'm super excited by this work we're doing here on building both two-dimensional racetracks, and we're doing a lot of work on three-dimensional racetracks. It's very exciting.
I remember you did the demonstration with TSMC, I think.
Yes, it wasn't TSMC, it was a group, ITRI, in Taiwan. Yeah. Because at some point in IBM, I had no funding. And then TC Chen, who was a very nice guy. He was head of IBM's work on all semiconductor research. He had a lot of people working for him and huge budgets. And I said, I used to be very supportive. And I said, look, I've got no money to do this. And so he's the one who said, oh, we should go to ITRI and see whether they would support it. And that's what happened. And then I had to go to Taiwan and make a presentation. And eventually, together we worked on this. They did the CMOS circuits, and then we incorporated the racetracks, and we were able to build a fully functional racetrack device.
Yeah, that was quite impressive demonstration.
Yeah, that was a nice demonstration. Yeah, but in those days it was still in plane magnetized, very large domain walls. And then after that we moved to out of plane magnetized walls that had much smaller in size, which is very important.
During that period and also before, you had many good students.
Yes, many good students.
Masamitsu Hayashi, and you had Hyun-Soo Yang and some other people.
Yes, Hyun-Soo, yes, indeed, yeah.
Most of them are still in the same field, and they are leading different area.
Certainly Masamitsu and Hyun-Soo, they've both done very well, and University of Tokyo and National University of Singapore. That's right.
Yeah, so you did very nice job for education as well.
Yes, so I really enjoyed I very much enjoyed working with these PhD students, because it gives you a longer term perspective. You can spend more years, and everything takes so much time. And if you have students who are really interested and intelligent and can think beyond the obvious, you can do great things. That was fantastic. That's what I like particularly here at Max Planck. I have a fantastic set of PhD students, and many of them are extremely good.
Yes. So why did you decide to move to the Max Planck?
I mostly moved to Max Planck because I got married to Claudia Felser, and then she was in Germany, and she said there was this opportunity. First, I looked at several places in Germany, including in Dresden. And then this opportunity came up at Max Planck here. And I think I was a little bit naive. I didn't really appreciate what it meant to be a director for Max Planck and how much work it would take to build a facility here that could do the type of research that I would like to do. But nevertheless, I still, think it's been a fantastic opportunity. Max Planck is really fantastic in terms of their support for science, for exploratory fundamental science. And I think they've been very generous. Basically, we took this building, completely renovated from top to bottom. I built entirely new laboratories, got a fantastic system for making thin films using multiple techniques, all coupled together, made here, plus characterization, a small clean room for building devices, high-speed electronics, all sorts of things. So we can do really fantastic research.
Yes. So what kind of thing do you think to be the most satisfying factor in your job?
I think these young people seeing them do great science and coming up with new ideas. For me, it's one of the most is fantastic to work with people who are as excited as I am in science and research and pushing the boundaries and going beyond. These are all things that I'm super excited by, and I think that's great if you find people you can resonate with who are equally excited. And then I like working with young people, but also postdocs are very good, and scientists too. All the guys, women and men who are really interested in basically pushing the boundaries and doing something new. And this is really what I like to do. I always say to my students, I like to do things where you really don't know the path. You have a concept, but you don't know how to get there, and then it's exciting to find ways of getting what you get there to what you think might be possible. And so that's what excites me.
Yes, of course, quite interesting. And could you tell us what kind of research direction you would like to take in the future in Max Planck?
So I have a lot of things I want to do. One is I want to make racetrack a reality. I think we're close to that. I'm super interested in three-dimensional structures. So we built a super resolution 3D printer in which we can make scaffolds with, let's say, geometrical chirality, and we can combine that with spin chirality. This is very interesting. I'm very interested in going back to a project I started at IBM, which is, can we make new types of superconducting materials at interfaces? And this is something I wanted to do at IBM, but I never had really the resources. So now here we've built all these capabilities, and now I've gone back to working on superconductivity at interfaces. So we already got some very exciting results. We discovered this Josephson diode effect in a variety of materials by proximal superconductivity in different systems as simple as platinum, just published. And this is very interesting. And I want to go back to, let's say, concepts where anti-ferromagnetic spin fluctuations, maybe chiral spin fluctuations, could induce pairing to form Cooper pairs in neighboring layers. This is what we're working on. And so I want to do more work on this. I think this is really exciting. And although the recent discoveries of high temperature superconductivity under extreme pressure is really in hydrides, it's super exciting. Nevertheless, it says, even though my materials are entirely different, nevertheless, it says, you can get to very high temperature superconductivity. This is what we're working on. And I think this is very interesting, and different types of unconventional superconductivity. I'm very interested in triplet superconductivity, where can we create supercurrents that carry angular momentum and use these to manipulate magnetization. This is one of my most important projects now. And I just got a European Research Council advanced grant to build a super track, I call it, which is basically a racetrack at low temperatures that will operate with very little energy by using supercurrents, triplet supercurrents, and Josephson diode to detect the moving domain walls. This is what we're focusing on. So we have a number of projects like this, which is very exciting.
Yes, yes.
So I just bought
many
this.
ideas.
Yeah. So I just bought this. We bought a delusion printer like 18 months ago, which enabled us to start working on these things. And I just bought a second one, so we can put more effort into this cryogenic racetrack. My concept is that cryogenic racetrack or cryogenic memories are needed for quantum computing. And the very fact now that people will consider cryogenic systems on the cloud means you need cryogenic memories. So it's more relevant today than it ever has been.
Yes. In order to carry out those research, you've got army of people from all over the world. So do you have any advice, especially to the younger generation, how you established these worldwide collaborations?
I think you just have to, okay, so you want to work with people who are really excited by doing new types of science, discovering new phenomena and new materials, new devices, and sort of going beyond what others are doing. So I don't believe in just if somebody, publishes a paper trying to do something the same in a slightly different system. I want to have my own ideas and follow them, even if they make no real, people think they make no sense. Because way back in time, as I said, in the earliest times, people told me, in spin valves, so it's all bulk spin dependent scattering. You're totally wrong. It's not interface, and I was totally right. And I think you need some intuition. I think. I don't know. I think intuition plays a big role. I think, and yeah. So I think so. But yeah, I would tell young people, yeah, you've got to use intuition and try to do things that nobody else has done, even if they seem impossible. Do the impossible. I think is very important. And you should, of course, there's a fantastic people worldwide doing great science, but you want to find your own niche to do something which is different and exciting and interesting. And I think that's what excites me.
I think that's true for probably everybody.
Probably true for everybody. Yeah, totally. I think that's why we do science.
Yes, yes.
You want to push these boundaries and go where nobody's been before. It's fantastic. I think we're very lucky to be in the positions that we are in, where we can try all sorts of things.
And you have so many activities, and how you can manage your work-life balance.
Oh, what balance? Oh, well, that's a good question. First, how to manage all these activities. And, I like to have a very flat structure where, everybody here can access any piece of equipment if they're properly trained. And I think it's really important. The equipment doesn't belong to any individual. It's just, we want to work together. And at the same time, I want to give people a lot of independence, right? I want people to contribute to projects, come up with their own ideas, but with the theme that we're interested in, which is this really atomically engineered materials which are relevant, either from a fundamental point of view or technological point of view. It's very simple. And I want people to be, come up with brilliant new ideas. And work-life balance, well, I think in the end, as a scientist, it's like, largely speaking, it's your whole life. Because what is more exciting than doing science? There's nothing more exciting in my mind. And so, I mean, that's what I think. What does it mean, work-life balance? Okay, I bicycle to work. You need to exercise a little bit, but overall, I think there's nothing more exciting than carrying out research and reading scientific papers and writing your own. I think to me, there's nothing more exciting than that.
So coming to some other topics related to the IEEE. So you served as a member of the administrative committee sometime, and also you did the distinguished lecturer as well. So how did you find those to be useful for your research career, or do you have any advice to the IEEE activities?
Well, I think the IEEE is a great society. It, for example, organizes many meetings, which are typically in a particular subject, memories, solid state circuits. And I've been to many of these meetings around the world over the years. And I think I was very honored to be this distinguished lecturer from the IEEE Magnetic Society. And that's fantastic because it gives you, an additional opportunity to visit labs all over the world and to talk about your work and to learn what other people are doing. So I think in that sense, it's fantastic to show your work to be more visible, whilst at the same time being able to have an opportunity to see what other people are doing. So I think this is what the IEEE did for me, and I think that was fantastic.
That's very nice to hear. Thank you. And so this is part of the IEEE history project, oral history project. Do you think this project to be useful to record various significant achievements in our community. So that
I think it's good. Yeah, I think it's a good idea because history, people forget history, and they don't really recollect because people very bad at remembering what really happened and what people thought at that time. Because then people, they change. So the wisdom, whatever, as you said, there are all these debates which are eventually resolved. And then people forget that 90% thought this, but in fact it was the 10% who were right. I think in that sense it's good because it shows that debate is important, and that just because the majority thinks one thing doesn't mean it's correct. In the same reason that people publish these papers, it doesn't mean they're correct. I think this is very important. You should take, you have to be discriminating when you read papers.
Yeah. And also, I think you have been quite enthusiastic on outreach kind of activities as well. When you were in IBM, you set up the growth system, which can be accessed through the internet and so on. So do you see any STEM activities to be initiated to encourage younger generation to stay in science?
I think it's a very interesting question. As I said, science to me is really one of the most exciting types of work that you can do, because it gives you an opportunity to do entirely new things and to think creatively. But of course, there are other areas of society where you can do similar things. I think in STEM these days, it's quite tough in the sense that particularly young academics, they have so many things they need to do in terms of teaching, funding, training young students, doing research, publishing high impact papers, getting all the funding I mean, it's very tough. And having a work-life balance when you're young, having a family. So I can see all of that. And I think these days it's a tough life. And particularly, I think also it's in some sense, I think academics are not so well paid, I would say, compared to similar jobs with young people with similar skills. If you go into industry, typically in America or in Germany, in Europe, you would be paid, 2 or 3 times as much. So it's a tough decision to say to your family, "Oh, I'm going to earn much less and work harder." Typically, so it's a tough decision. But at the same time, so I don't know the answer to that. I think. And also, I think science is becoming not more difficult, but it's becoming more sophisticated. And sophistication means, let's say, in our own field, the cost of the equipment you need to, let's say, make a thin film, to characterize it, everything costs $1 million or euros. It's really expensive. It's tough to do it as a small group. So you really need a larger group of people. It's tough then to work, and then you no longer have this complete independence that you really want. So it's a trade-off. So of course, many universities now, MIT, Harvard, Stanford, they're setting up centers with tools that people can have access to. I think this is maybe a good way of moving forward in the future, but it costs a lot of money. And it needs to be sustained over a long period of time. The tooling requires experts to run them and engineers to maintain them. But I think this is just the way of doing research has to evolve a little bit. But that's good too. No, nothing is static. Things change. This is good.
Yeah. And it's nice to have some collaborations.
Yeah, I like collaboration. So one thing being at a company like IBM, of course, the company has to protect its intellectual property. Then you're less free to collaborate. The nice thing now, let's say Max Planck is, you're totally free, and I think that's very nice. And I have set up a lot of collaborations now within Germany and throughout Europe, and it's wonderful to be able to collaborate much more extensively than I could before.
I think we covered various aspects in your career, and especially research. So thank you very much for your time. And do you have any concluding remarks to the audience?
No, just say, I think it's, you have to be independent and to do your own thing and to follow your own path and go beyond, do the impossible, and then enjoy the journey.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.